Hello and welcome to this very interesting event. We're co-hosting as Verco with GRESB and IPF, covering the 2022 GRESB results for the UK, and then focusing on the specific and increasingly important topic of embodied carbon in a panel discussion. I'm Dave Worthington, Verco Managing Director, and joining me for this event, Anna Olink, EMEA Real Estate Business Development Director, Brett Omrod, Net Zero Carbon Lead at Lazal Investment Management, Matthew Collins, Construction and Infrastructure Management Senior Specialist at RICS, and Victor Fonseca, Real Estate Associate at GRESB. So just a few words of introduction from me before we get into the main part of the discussion and event. So it's been absolutely fantastic to see the importance and participation in the annual GRESB assessment grow over the years, particularly in the UK, and the huge impact that this has had on the industry in improving both ESG governance and management. And it's also great to see the addition of an embodied carbon indicator for the 2023 assessment, and that's something we'll be exploring in more detail in the panel discussion. The GRESB assessment and the more recent link with the CREM carbon risk assessment tool has played a major role in focusing attention on operational emissions and the reductions that the industry needs to achieve to play its part in meeting the Paris Agreement goals and limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. But operational emissions are really only half the story, as the extent of building retrofit works that we need in order to meet the long-term carbon targets are set to generate what some refer to as a sort of carbon burp of embodied emissions, as we have to use lots of additional materials and services to kind of achieve those lower energy use intensities and carbon emissions. So it's absolutely crucial that the industry maintains a whole building and a whole life carbon perspective, and aims to minimise the cumulative emissions between now and 2050, as well as the sort of the end outcome in terms of operational performance. And clearly, as we sort of continue to rapidly burn through the residual carbon budget globally for 1.5 degrees, then that becomes an absolutely key target for the industry. So I will kind of shortly hand over to Anna to cover the GRESB results for the UK. Just to say that please send through any questions at any time during the event using the questions button. We will be covering a Q&A generally at the end of the panel discussion, and that includes any questions you might have on the real estate assessment results. And with that, over to you, Anna.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, David. And thank you all for joining us here today live. My name is Anna Olink. I'm based in Amsterdam, and I head up business development for our real estate platform in EMEA at GRESB. Over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to take you through more in-depth and hopefully insightful look at the 2022 assessment results for the United Kingdom. So let's start this off by zooming out just a bit before we go into the UK results by highlighting some of the top line figures for the real estate benchmark. Overall, we are seeing here that the 2022 real estate benchmark had the largest ever growth in total number, with 1,820 entities now participating in the GRESB real estate assessment worldwide. This is an increase of 300 entities since 2021. These 1,820 entities cover $6.9 trillion of gross asset value across 74 countries globally. In regard to scores, the average GRESB score increased by a point to 74 for the standing investments benchmark and by 2 points to 81 in the development benchmark. Now let's move to the overall participation split by country and further focus on the United Kingdom. Participation in Europe grew by 16% year over year to cover 907 entities in 2022, now representing half of the entire GRESB universe. Those 907 European funds and companies account for 56,000 assets with over 500 million square meters of floor area and GAV of 1.6 trillion US dollars. The UK participation is just here on the top in the red, showing that 264 UK entities participated in the GRESB assessment in 2022. Far behind the UK, you can see participation of pan-European funds, represented by 194 entities, followed by Germany with 102 entities. These 264 UK entities account for over 13,000 assets, with over 100 million square meters of floor area and GAV of 395 billion USD, and that would be around 330 billion British pounds today. Participation in the UK grew by net 7 entities year over year. If this does not sound too impressive, I would like to add that we actually welcomed 14 new participants this year, including 15 new logo entities submitted by a new manager. At the same time, 33 UK entities discontinued reporting, and the vast majority of those stopped reporting because they were acquired, divested, or liquidated. As you might recall, last year proved to be a good year for M&As. The UK is one of the markets where the overall market coverage for GRESB participation continues to be strong. It is certainly a mature market in terms of GRESB ESG adoption and seems to be therefore ahead of many other markets in terms of their preparation for an ever-increasing demand for ESG data driven by both investors and regulators alike. And that's what we'll analyze further in the next section. So just to remind, the GRESB score and rating represents an annual snapshot of what is otherwise a continuous effort from organizations to advance their ESG performance. What informs those scores is a mountain of data that can support a wide variety of fund managers and institutional investors' need when it comes to ESG. Despite the lagged impact of the pandemic recovery affecting some participants' performance scores, the GRESB average score for the UK has improved by 1 point to 71. The improvement is mainly driven by an increased adoption of building certifications, higher rate of ESG data verification and assurance, as well as significant pickup in participants' effort around target setting. It is worth highlighting that the improved overall score was achieved despite the fact that the UK welcomed so many new logo participants, and many of the long-standing GRESB participants went through an acquisition and discontinued reporting. What we can see on the next slide, the scores of first-year participants tend to be lower as their ESG journey has often just begun. And that's what's illustrated on this slide. As you can see, entities that have performed for 10, 11, 12 plus years experience stronger performance in the GRESB benchmark as compared to the newer entities submitting to GRESB for the first or second time. This trend is very much expected as GRESB is a journey for improvement, and we see that coming through clearly when the reporting entities build on those scores year after year. And that being said, it's very encouraging to see that the ESG starting point and the performance of new participants in 2022 is significantly higher than in previous years. This clearly exemplifies that the ESG gap between newcomers and leaders has been reducing faster over time, a clear sign in the growing sophistication and awareness of the industry when it comes to ESG considerations. And now let's have a look at some of the performance-related metrics and results in the 2022 real estate benchmark for the UK. First of all, let's go through some of the definitions here. When I talk about Europe, I mean all countries in Europe, and that includes the UK. So in line with the global trend, the UK participants' ability to collect performance data continue to improve year over year. However, comparing the average data coverage with that of the region, we see that the UK lags behind in the ability to collect performance data across all performance indicators, with the gap being most significant in water data coverage. For the assets where participants were able to collect performance data, we see that for energy and greenhouse gas emissions, the recovery from the pandemic has impacted UK participants to a lesser extent than in the rest of the region. UK participants were even able to display a reduction in year-over-year greenhouse gas emissions, which seems not to be driven by the equivalent reduction in energy usage, and are likely coming either from an increased use of on-site renewable energy or the decarbonization of the grid. Preparation for a net zero future is on top of the agenda for investors, managers, and GRESB. And our data shows that preparations are well underway. Next to the progress with data collection that we discussed on the previous slide, we also see an accelerating rate of efficiency measures implementation. The top of this slide shows that 61% of all UK assets have been subject to the implementation of at least one energy efficiency measure in the last 3 years. In addition, 25% of all UK portfolios have an on-site renewable energy installed. While this percentage sounds encouraging, those portfolios still have a long way to go, as only 1% of their total energy consumption is covered by these on-site renewable energy facilities. Target setting for greenhouse gas reduction has also improved significantly, and in 2022, nearly a third of UK entities reported zero emission targets. However, that translates to only 4% of assets in the UK that already report zero emissions. And yes, that's only 4% of over 15,000 assets in the UK in the benchmark that can report zero emissions. But you can also add a positive spin to this information. The leaders have emerged. They might be with us on this call. The conversation is maturing, the cohort is growing, and if you are not among those who already report assets with zero emissions to us, well, now you know that that's what your peers are doing, and that's the power of benchmarking. The last part of the performance results that I would like to highlight is regarding some CREM analysis we have run, which is similar to the output of the GRESB transition risk report. What we see here is the aggregated CREM result for all UK assets that have a corresponding CREM pathway. The CREM pathways, as you may know, are set at a sector and national level. The graph shows that on average, UK assets with a corresponding pathway are already exposed to transition risk. In terms of share of underlying assets from that average, 29% of the floor area is already above the relevant pathway. Putting this into the broader context of the region, these insights are in line with the 30% of Europe's floor area being exposed to transition risk. Comparing this to past forecasts, we see that in 2020, performance data showed only 25% of the floor area above its corresponding CREM pathway. So we saw a 5 percentage point deterioration since 2022. What this difference shows is that COVID led to lower energy and carbon intensities, which underinflated CREM performance. Now the data is stabilizing, it shows that we are actually worse off than when the analysis was first performed. As I close out the 2022 results for the UK, I thought it would be worthwhile to touch on some of the upcoming changes to the 2023 GRESB standards. As you may know, the GRESB Foundation published the 2023 standards just a couple of weeks ago, which is the earliest we have ever released changes to the upcoming year's assessment. First, I wanted to briefly touch on the standards development process, which is led by the GRESB Foundation. The GRESB Foundation is an independent, not-for-profit organization that sets global standards for assessing the environmental, social, and governance performance of real estate, infrastructure, and other assets. The GRESB Foundation enables our standards to be industry-led, feature best-in-class governance, and lastly, independence from GRESB BV, which is the group that assesses, validates, benchmarks, and scores based on the GRESB standards. The aims and objectives of the 2023 standard development was to first focus on the key issues. This identification of the most important issues was informed by member feedback collected over the years, in addition to an industry-wide survey administered just 1 year ago. Second, the Foundation wanted to maximize the number of changes while minimizing disruption to participants. The exercise resulted in the climate society being the overarching topics identified as the key issues for 2023, and then it was drilled into subtopics, which are net zero, physical climate risk, transition risk, embodied carbon, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here we can see exactly how those topics translate into being integrated into the 2023 GRESB Real Estate Standard. For example, we have an introduction to net zero policies, which will also be scored in 2023. While not being scored, we do have an introduction of net zero commitments, targets, and disclosure. Another example is around physical and transition risk identification and impact assessment, which is also scored for 2023. I will leave the 2023 standards at that, as we have recently hosted 2 dedicated sessions on the GRESB Foundation update and 2023 standard changes. The replays of the sessions are available on our website at www.gresb.com. And with that, I would like to thank you all for attention during the 2022 UK results part of this event. Please do not hesitate to post questions in the question box. We will aim to answer them at the end of the event. And now I would like to hand it back to Dave to lead us through the panel discussion. Dave.
Thank you very much, Anna. And great to see just how well the UK real estate market has done in the last year, as well as a summary of the changes that you're planning to make. So at this point, I'll bring in the other panel members as briefly introduced at the start. So yeah, welcome Brett, Matt and Victor. So to kick off this panel discussion on embodied carbon, I'd like to start with Victor, really following on from what Anna was saying about the forthcoming changes to the GRESB assessment. So obviously it's an increasingly important topic for the sector more broadly. So keen to hear a bit more from you, Victor, on exactly how GRESB is looking to tackle this topic in specifically in the next year's survey and kind of more generally in the future.
Thanks, Dave. So as Anna said, GRESB is now having the standards mandated by the GRESB Foundation. And so the fact that embodied carbon is now included in the 2023 standards, it speaks for itself. It is an increasingly important ESG issue. It is extremely material for net zero targets and climate change mitigation, but also investors are looking and asking for it in order to inform the investment decision making. But we also appreciate the barriers that we have now in order to quantify and measure embodied carbon. Many of fund managers don't have robust processes in place to quantify this throughout different projects, development projects, or if they do, this is not standardized, which is very hard for us to compare this data. So with that being said, GRESB wants to evolve the materiality of the issue within the assessment alongside the members and the industry. And this will happen with GRESB starting to collect embodied carbon data at the fund level, so separately for new construction and major renovation projects, but not only collecting the embodied carbon intensity or embodied carbon absolute value, but also what goes and feeds into this measurement, such as life cycle stages, building layers, but also like the percentage of development projects that this number represents of your portfolio. But this is not the end goal. As Anna said, we are going through a 5-year roadmap, which we will evolve the standards in the future. And this is no different for embodied carbon. So we will increase the granularity of data collection in the coming years, which will allow us to better benchmark this data and also provide better actionable insights for our members, so investors and managers, to be able to pinpoint these embodied carbon hotspots and reduce its impact and further align with net zero targets that not only aim to operational carbon, but also the whole life carbon of an asset. So this is more or less what's coming and what's in these 2023 standards and in the coming years.
And that's really interesting. And just a brief sort of follow up on that. To what extent was this something that you felt you needed to introduce to sort of move the market on, or something that participants were sort of asking GRESB to include?
We had like a lot of conversations with our standards committee throughout the year 2022, and it was identified there was a lot of barriers in order to compare this data. There was a lack of standardization in the results of life cycle assessments. EPD data availability is not well spread through the market. So start scoring this indicator now, or collecting these metrics at the asset level would not be aligned with the readiness of the market to report to it. So this is more like sending a message, raising awareness. This is an important topic, and we will start to look to this topic in more detail and in more granularity in the future. So yeah, this year is going to be a non-scored indicator, and throughout the evolvement of the standards, we will look to score or increase the granularity of data collection.
Great, thanks. And kind of reference standards, probably perfect segue to sort of move on to Matt. Matt, obviously the RICS professional statement for whole life carbon assessments for the built environment has been the sort of default industry standard for some time, since 2017, but a lot of things have changed since then. So I understand there's a pretty significant update sort of in progress. So great if you could just expand a bit for us on what that involves, and the sort of bit of the detail and what the team have been looking at on that update.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and good afternoon to everybody on the call. So yes, the existing RICS whole life carbon assessment professional statement, as you say, Dave, was published in 2017 and became a mandatory professional statement for the RICS membership in 2018. But obviously, there's been a lot of developments in the wider sustainability space, but specifically carbon measurement and reporting since that date. But I think it's probably important just to reflect on kind of the success of the 2017 professional statement. As you say, it is kind of the preeminent industry standard for calculating carbon in accordance with the European standard, which is EN 15978, which itself is now going through a period of revision. And the first thing to probably clarify is that the updated RICS professional standard, as it'll be known, not a professional statement, will align with that. So there's people involved with both update of both documents to make sure that they align appropriately. As people on the call may know, we're strongly supported by the Environmental Audit Committee's House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee's May 2022 report as the kind of standard methodology for calculation of whole life and embodied carbon specifically. It's been adopted by a number of organisations, the GLA here in the UK and in London specifically being one, and it's widely used by developers and consultants, and hopefully a lot of people on the call here today as their methodology for calculating whole life carbon. But obviously, as I say, there's been a lot of developments in the industry, and we are looking to make some quite significant changes to that. And I suppose the first one of the more fundamental changes we're looking to make is to introduce a three-phased concept of carbon, a whole life carbon assessment. So whereas the current professional statement essentially just sets out the methodology and doesn't necessarily identify or mandate where, when and how that assessment should be done, what we're looking to do now is to essentially put that into a three-phased approach. So we're kind of tentatively calling them concept design, planning and tender, and post-completion. And we recognise that those are kind of quite vague headings, and that's suitably done to ensure that they align with not just the RIBA stages of work, but all of the recognised planning processes as well. And obviously, what that will do is encourage much earlier assessment of projects, construction and building assets at a much earlier stage, so organisations and clients can have a much earlier understanding of what their likely whole life carbon output is going to be. But obviously they can't do that without access to more data. So the updated professional standard will include a lot more information in terms of where that data can come from, EPDs, for example, but also introduce the concept of circular economy thinking in terms of the whole retrofit versus demolition and new build argument, just to encourage all of those things to be considered at the appropriate time. It'll also align with another international standard, ICMS 3, the International Cost Management Standard version 3, which is an international standard which has been developed by a number of 49 or so organisations globally to develop a high-level framework reporting mechanism for both cost and carbon, and that's to obviously encourage the view that carbon is as important as cost, if not more so. That might be a little bit of wishful thinking, but I think that's ultimately where we've got to get to if we're going to get anywhere near those targets that have been set by governments and organisations around the world. And I suppose ultimately what we're looking to do is set a much more defined standard for whole life carbon assessment and reporting to make sure that actually what's being done is being done on a consistent and comparable basis. And one of the ways that we're going to do that is include as a kind of standalone piece of work which has recently been completed is a definitions document. So a group of industry professionals have recently and all professional organisations have got together to develop a definitions document in terms of all of the, what net zero truly means specifically in a UK context, so that everybody can actually be working towards the same definition, and that includes, all of the various definitions of carbon in terms of, whole life carbon, embodied carbon, upfront embodied carbon, whole life embodied carbon, operation. All of those things have been agreed on, hopefully by industry now, so we can have some actual alignment in terms of when we use them. And a couple more. The first one of those is probably to say that the professional standard will be expanded into infrastructure as well. So whilst the existing professional statement is predominantly aimed at buildings and commercial buildings at that, the updated document will kind of cover infrastructure as well, and will expand upon the scope of which type of projects and assets it's applicable to. And then the final one, and one that's probably quite significant, is we're going to introduce the concept of carbon contingency, which I'm a quantity surveyor by background, so I'm used to dealing with cost contingencies, and carbon contingency is very much a similar thing, in that obviously when a whole life carbon assessment is undertaken at an early stage, it's generally based on fairly limited information. So to be accurate in that assessment is highly unlikely, let's be honest. So when that's done, what we're doing is making a suggestion around a range of contingency that an assessor should put on their assessment to make sure that the client or the organisation for which they're doing that assessment understands that that isn't it's impossible to give a single figure at that stage. But what can be done is to give a range of plus or minus 25%, for example, at an early stage, to say that dependent on design development, construction processes, replacement cycles, etc., which will come with time, that confidence level will become greater, and that contingency will reduce as the project life cycle advances.
Fantastic. I know there's lots of interesting kind of aspects of that. Just follow up on a couple of them, and just that last point around the contingency. So I understand the concept of starting out obviously with higher error margins, and those narrow down as you progress through the project. But assume you may still need some contingency even at the completion stage if you're still having to use secondary factors, for example, and unable to get kind of EPDs for your materials, that sort of thing.
No, absolutely, Dave, and that unfortunately is when you're trying to predict something, the reporting period of say 60 years life cycle of a building, which we know buildings are designed to last longer than that, but in terms of a sort of benchmarked period, that's the industry standard. But when you're trying to predict that far into the future, it's very, very difficult. You've got to take into account things like grid decarbonisation and how quickly that'll happen, all those types of things. So yeah, it's practically impossible, I would say, to be able to predict to a real degree of real accuracy those things. So there's always going to be an element of this of enabling or allowing for a contingency. So that's something that we want to come across in the document. We want to make clear that giving a single point of truth is just not not likely in these scenarios.
That's really interesting. It sounds there's some similarities with what I understand happens in France with their compliance regulations on embodied carbon calculations, where there's a sort of penal factor applied if you don't have good enough quality primary data.
Yes, absolutely that, Dave. Yeah, and that's kind of where we developed the idea from. I suppose the final thing to say is obviously none of these, whilst we've got all of these ideas, if you like, in the document as drafted currently, the document isn't finalised. We're still in the drafting process, and we'll be going to full public consultation early in 2023. When the whole industry will be, encouraged to review the document and respond upon it and provide feedback. So, all of that will be taken into consideration. If there's things in there that aren't deemed kind of workable or considered, lacking in detail, then all of those things will be worked upon before final publication, which is expected in the spring of next year. Brilliant.
Okay, well, to move on to Brett. So see LaSalle, a huge owner and developer or manager of assets. So you're obviously having to respond to these various standards and schemes that we've been discussing thus far. So great to hear a bit from you, Brett, on sort of what the picture at LaSalle, how you're currently sort of reporting on or looking at embodied carbon as a business, what you've been doing to date, and how you're sort of adapting to these changing industry standards.
Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. It's very good to be with you all. So at LaSalle, we've worked hard to ensure that reporting on embodied carbon is a requirement for all new developments and major refurbishments, and we've done that through embedding it within our sort of sustainable development checklist. But not only is it baked into reporting, but actually into our business practice. So at LaSalle, we take a refurbishment first approach, not only because it makes good commercial sense, but actually, it makes a good sense from a carbon perspective as well. So if the bones of a building, i.e. the sort of substructure and superstructure of good quality, the right dimensions of the grid, then why would we demolish and rebuild something in its place? And a good example of this is on One Exchange Square, which is one of our major refurbishment developments in London, where we are targeting Letty Upfront B, ensuring that the savings alone on the steelwork equate to around half the steel used to construct the Eiffel Tower, which is sort of pretty significant. I digress slightly, but on reporting of embodied carbon, this also creates a huge opportunity for LaSalle. And we want to be able to demonstrate leadership. So I mentioned One Exchange Square, but there are also a number of pioneering projects on continental Europe. But there are also challenges, and the challenges involve consistency when reporting across European jurisdictions. So in nearly all of the countries, embodied carbon is not regulated. However, this is quickly changing, as Matt mentioned. And although the consequences of limited regulation is that most projects follow a methodology with one of the building certification systems, such as BREEAM or LEED, which often only report on a sort of limited scope of building elements or life cycle. And this makes comparability between projects quite difficult for us. So at LaSalle, we've stipulated the RICS professional standard now to be used when measuring and reporting embodied carbon, and really welcome the new GRESB scoring system adopting this RICS professional standard. So I think, in sort of closing remarks on this one is that, accurate data reporting leads to better strategic decision making, and this is particularly true of embodied carbon, more and more so. We've seen that on operational, but it's really moving quickly towards embodied carbon as well.
Fantastic, that's right. And just brief follow-up, you, Matt. Actually, could you just explain the difference between a professional statement and professional standards?
I can, yeah, and it'll be very quickly. There really isn't one, Dave. It's just a redefining, if you like, of the RICS's literature that we put out. So currently, we put out a number of types of document, we put out standards, we put out guidance, we put out professional statements, we put out information papers, all that type of thing. So what we're doing is trying to simplify all of that for our members and obviously the wider industry. So, you know, going into next year, you will see just professional standards and professional practice information, and that will be it in terms of, you know, what the RICS produces and what members will be required to adhere to.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I'll move on to some specific questions that we've had come through. But just a reminder to everyone that wants to ask a question of the panelists, or indeed any questions from Anna's earlier presentation on the UK GRESB results, then please use your questions button. But just a follow-up for Victor. If you just talk about which life stages are covered in the GRESB assessment, which of the kind of building life stages?
Yes, so like as I mentioned, we are capturing separately the major renovation projects and also the new construction. So the life cycle stages is basically the upfront carbon when it comes to new construction. But we have like different selection, right? If you are just looking at the product stage, or also transportation and construction, and this happens the same for the major renovation part of the indicator. So you can select which life cycle stages are included, and these are very granular. So A1 to A3, A4, A5. So, and of course, other, if you would like to go more specific when it comes to end of life, or the materials that you are removing from the building when it comes to retrofit. So we have all the life cycle stages there, and we are basing these life cycle stages also in the EN 15978. And just to also add, the building layers are also based on the RICS standards. So just to link to Matthew's.
Great, and that takes me to another question actually for Matt, which is whether in the update to the professional standards, you're considering expanding the scope of the assessments at all, in terms of life cycle stages, or other components. Is that something that's under discussion?
In a fashion, but obviously the modules are fixed by the EN standard. But one thing we are doing, and perhaps I should have made this a point when I was talking about the changes that we're making, is in the current professional statement, we sort of specify that module D is reported separately into when the whole life carbon assessment's been undertaken. We're now changing that to reflect that. Again, going back to that point around, you know, more circular economy thinking in terms of being able to make accurate comparisons between options at early stages. So if there's a demolition involved potentially a demolition involved in a project, then that module D will be required to be reported in the upfront stages, if that doesn't sound too confusing, so that, you know, clients and organisations are completely clear over what their overall carbon assessment figure is, as opposed to just almost reporting it below the line and kind of separately, if that makes sense, which is sometimes the case currently.
Do you want to just expand briefly on what module D covers? There's just some participants.
Yeah, so module D, for those that aren't aware, is essentially the elements beyond the system boundary. So it's the end of life of the building, the demolition of the building once its life has been expended, and then what you do with that demolition. So do you the materials that you're potentially demolishing, do you reuse them, recycle them, or they go to landfill? And it's all the associated carbon emissions with that whole process, which obviously can be quite significant depending on the size of the building that you're talking about. And again, it's to encourage that, you know, that well-coined phrase, circular economy thinking around, can some of this be reused and salvaged appropriately in terms of the overall project that you're undertaking. So it's considering that more upfront than perhaps is currently the case.
Okay, I've got one question that I'm going to put to all three of you. I think we'll go Victor, Matt, Brett, in terms of order here. So, so it's general one in terms of what key advice that you'd give to companies that are just starting out on their journey to reporting and acting on embodied carbon. So, kind of top tips that those attending might be able to take away and start applying in their businesses. So, yeah, Victor, if you like to start us on that one.
So like I think I will have two key advices, which basically put processes in place to make sure that you are collecting accurate and comparable data, because this is going to be key in order for you to understand what are the hotspots and create a strategy, a plan to reduce this impact in the first place. But also, you have to engage with your suppliers. You have to make sure that you are making the right choices when it comes to materials that you're using, or like do you have to demolish this building, or is it better for you to do a retrofit and you have less impact? So also EPDs, making sure that you have the environmental product declarations to assess, before actually constructing the building, what would be the expected impact. So these are more or less the advices on the GRESB perspective, on the more generic perspective on how to approach now and in the future.
Great, thanks, Victor. And Matt, I assume everyone used the RICS standard.
I would love it if that was the case, Dave. But no, absolutely agree with what Victor says there. And I suppose the first thing to say, without sounding wanting to come across as too patronising, is don't be overwhelmed. I think to most people, the concept of measuring embodied carbon specifically is a bit odd and a bit scary, because it's you can't see it. It's not something that you can physically see. We're talking about measuring something which is intangible. It's not something you can touch or feel or smell. So it's kind of almost theoretical in some respects. But there is an awful lot of information out there, not just from the RICS. We're just one organisation, one professional body here. There's loads of information out there. I would suggest anybody that wants to go out and find out more about embodied carbon and whole life carbon looks at the UK GBC's guides, the LETI guidance. There's a lot of information out there that sets out in a very kind of clear and comprehensive way what this process is, what embodied carbon is, what it covers, and then what people can do in terms of assessing it, which, as you say, the RICS is the leading methodology in that respect. But there's a lot of information out there. And I suppose next, building on from Victor's point, is understand the process. A lot of people don't necessarily come into contact with whole life carbon assessments, embodied carbon assessments, apart from in the way of software tools. So there's numerous software tools out there, one-click LCA and eTool, for just two of many, which essentially do everything for you. So you select a few materials, you select the size of your building and the material quantities, and do all that for you, and that's fine. But I think people that really want to understand this and really want to understand how they can make a difference to their overall embodied carbon output is to probably understand a little bit more around how they can make that difference. So understand, as Victor said, around demolition versus retrofit, and just understanding what materials are more carbon intensive than others, and what processes are more carbon intensive than others, to be able to understand where they can actually, with quite subtle and small differences to a new building particularly, make some quite significant embodied carbon reductions. So
focus on the hotspots and the kind of big material things first.
Absolutely.
Move on to the detail later.
Yeah.
Good advice. And Brett.
Thanks. Tough to follow on up, Victor and Matt. I think, firstly, congratulations to everyone who is starting to report on embodied carbon. It is a challenge, but you really should be. The regulations, it's coming soon. It's coming to get you. And my key advice really is to sort of mandate best-in-class reporting. Follow an approach, and I would recommend the RICS Professional Standard on all new refurbishments and major developments. And then I think in terms of how to act on a project basis, I would say, and I'd always advise on initiating a conversation on embodied carbon really at project kickoff, at the onset. as this is a nuanced topic that really requires buy-in from a whole design team, whether those are architects, engineers, etc., there needs to be alignment on what you can collectively aim to achieve and what target you set. And then there also needs to be clear lines of responsibility on which teams collect what bits of information at what point through the design and construction process. And then I think, Matt touched on this a number of times, but, circularity and embodied carbon really go hand in hand. Therefore, embracing circularity principles will always improve a project's embodied carbon. So that's one other thing. And then finally, I think as most new projects sit on, as already cited, on brownfield sites, I would always encourage a specialist consultant to complete a pre-demolition report, just to investigate what elements, if any, can be retained. That goes back to sort of our refurbishment first approach, and that's also been picked up by both Victor and Matt throughout this conversation. So I think that's all I can add after those two great comments.
Fantastic. Yeah, and maybe just follow up on one thing you said, Matt. There are a number of tools out there, as you mentioned. Is there any significant differences in the kind of software in use in the market? Are there other sort of kind of simpler tools available that people can use if they don't want to go for a sort of full commercial product?
Yeah, so in terms of the differences between the two, I think there's some slight nuances, but I think a lot of these things, it depends on the information that goes in. So I know there's been examples cited that people may be aware of where the same building has been assessed via 2 or 3 different software tools and come up with 2 or 3 quite radically different answers, which probably doesn't suggest we've quite got this process right. But I think when you look into those kind of reports a bit further, I think what actually happens is the assumptions made specifically around the embodied carbon when the building's in use, so the operation, the replacement cycles around major maintenance and replacement of plant, for example, are different depending on the information that you put in, and that can have a huge impact on your overall embodied carbon. So that goes back to both Brett and Victor's points around being consistent and best in class here, and setting out your approach from day one. But there are a number of tools out there that are available, free of charge, for people to get a more kind of high level indicative output, shall we say. There's I think it's Hawkins Brown embodied carbon calculator. Hawkins Brown being a large design firm in London. They've got an embodied carbon tool which I think is freely available from their website, which gives it doesn't contain all the products and materials that obviously you potentially might be using, but it gives a good indication of frame types, should we say, superstructure types, to make an easy and a quick comparison. And then I suppose one thing that does lead on to is another sort of pan-industry initiative, the Built Environment Carbon Database, which the RSS is part of. It's not an RSES project, if you like. It's an industry project in collaboration with a lot of other professional bodies and a lot of other industry organisations to create, as it suggests, a database of both product and project level carbon data, and again, there's several of those that exist at the minute. Probably the most well known is the ICE database, which contains EPDs of a number of different product types. But I think one thing where the industry has probably failed there is that they're not. There's too many of them, shall we say? We've got too much information in too many disparate places. So the BECD is I hopefully say this with some confidence, will be the industry's go-to database for the UK, I should add, in respect to EPD information and future benchmarking information. So as that database gets more populated with whole life carbon assessments of actual projects, that then feeds into early stage benchmarking information for organisations to be able to compare their own projects against and give them an early indication against other comparable building types.
Great, thanks, Matt. And Victor, what's your sort of thought on the whole sort of benchmarking landscape in this area? Clearly, it's a space that GRESB can help with, because I think that it is quite hard to find really good quality benchmarks covering all asset types and geographies at the moment. So that there's a pretty big gap.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, when saying the evolving of the standards throughout the year, when we capture these at the fund level, of course, the level of benchmarking accuracy will decrease. But as we start moving forward and collect this data at the asset level, because we will not only know the asset type, but the location, and the benchmark will increase, the benchmark quality will increase over time, and then it will provide a better understanding. But now that, like, if we look to the global benchmark with 1,820 entities across the globe, it is unrealistic to imagine that everyone will be ready to provide this data at the asset level for all assets in their portfolio. So yeah, I think benchmarking it like with a better accuracy, like we'll be holding hands with moving this data collection to asset level instead of fund level. But yeah, we are not there yet. So and this was the whole conversation throughout the year with the standards committee on the real estate side at GRESB. But yeah, we envision that in the next years, in the future iterations of the indicator, we'll be able to increase this granularity of data collection and be able to provide better insights throughout the benchmarking of asset level data, or like embodied carbon per se.
Fantastic. Okay, I have one final question. There's still an opportunity for I think maybe take another one from the audience if you haven't managed to get your question in yet. But the question's really around the potential decarbonisation of the kind of materials and supply chain here, and there's a sort of analogous situation to what's happening on operational carbon with the electricity grid decarbonising as more renewables come forward, and that a number of the kind of material sort of industry bodies have brought forward these kind of quite ambitious decarbonisation plans, sort of steel zero, etc. But interested just in the panel's thoughts on just how those are should affect the way that we're looking at embodied carbon reductions, because clearly on one hand you could say, well, we can just sort of delay things and let those products decarbonize, and then the outcome will be lower, but it's not as simple as that. We need to do refurbishment works now, we need to build new developments. So there's a kind of a like difficult tension between the making the best of the products we have now and kind of material substitutions versus seeing the benefits of those reductions in the future. So less of a question, more of just interested in thoughts on how that affects the sort of work that you guys are doing, and probably more Brett and Matt on this one. Which of you two wants to go first on that?
I'll let you go, Brett. Yeah.
I'm happy to take a stab at that one. I think I feel quite strongly that whilst the deployment of renewable energy is sort of gaining a lot of traction across most of Europe, it's quite a mature technology. A lot of the decarbonization curves for steel and concrete, aluminium are still in their infancy. I would say the technology is not as mature. So I'm quite a strong advocate for actually using what we have now. I think the time for delaying is over. I think we've got to act now. We've got to use the technology that we have today. And I think we should be using those embodied carbon rates that are available today, and not plan and look to model future decarbonization rates at all. Yeah, that would be my simple take, without getting into too much detail by material type.
Great.
Maybe
Thanks,
if I may, just to provide also another perspective, I think also changes are always driven top down, either from investors' pressure or regulation, and these changes itself will come bottom up, which will be from the carbonization of the materials itself. So we GRESB, for example, are at the top down pressure. So like reflecting investors' perspective and also like aligning with future regulations. So I agree that like the carbonization of materials will, accelerate the reduction of embodied carbon impact, but just waiting on this would not be enough because changes have to happen now. So I think that's also the top-down pressure is very important for accelerating the market and in accelerating this decarbonization itself.
Great.
Yeah, no, both excellent points. I suppose, yeah, the targets and the kind of the trajectories that industries of materials industries have set are incredibly ambitious, but I think they need to be. I think the well-worn statistic that people have probably heard is, if the cement industry were a country, it'd be the third largest emitter of carbon in the world, behind the US and China. So obviously, I'm not picking on the cement industry specifically there, but that is one industry that is highly carbon intensive, but it knows that, and it's put out some very ambitious, as I say, proposals in terms of how it's going to decarbonize and how that can be achieved. But yeah, I think if we were to kind of just say, well, we'll wait until we've got complete grid decarbonisation and then everything's great, we're being a little bit naive, because that, one, we've got to trust that that's even going to happen, and two, that doesn't, that doesn't mean, that doesn't prevent anything from happening today. So we've got to go with what we've got, and we've got to go with the information that we know, and then work, as Victor said, from the top down, because that's coming, and the bottom up to meet that regulation that inevitably is falling into place. So very ambitious, which is great to see, but a kind of, let's carry on whilst we need to.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, I think good and consistent messages coming from the panel on that one. So I think that just leaves me to wrap up. So just briefly summarize. So we saw that the UK real estate industry is kind of making good progress towards the operational carbon reduction goals, but there are material transition risks ahead. So we do need rapid and significant action to be taken, and that will bring associated embodied carbon considerations. So it was great to hear the panel's thoughts on how we can best optimize embodied and whole life carbon. So we hope you found the event useful. If you'd like more information on the topic of embodied carbon specifically, members of the Verco real estate team are going to present an overview on the topic, some further insights into market updates, and a wider view on implications and the sort of decisions that you need to consider when reporting on embodied carbon. So that'll be on the 19th of January, 2 to 2:45 p.m. And people can register either in the events section of the GRESB website or on the Verco website. So all that remains is a huge thanks to all the speakers this afternoon, and to all of you for your excellent questions. I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you.